All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today I'm going to be talking to you about apps for visual scene displays. My name is Carolyn Buchanan. I'm a speech language pathologist and an assistive technology professional. I work as a regional coordinator at one of the FAAST regional demonstration centers. We're housed over at the University of Central Florida. I'm also a clinical instructor in their School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Today, I want to talk to you about what a visual scene display actually is, who might benefit from the use of a visual scene display, some of the considerations to keep in mind when you're designing a visual scene display, and then a few apps that support its use that you can find in an app store real easy to download. So in talking about a visual scene display, we're talking about ways of organizing vocabulary for augmentative and alternative communication systems. You can find them in a range of systems. I'm solely going to be talking about apps today, just because that's a frequent request that I have. But you can find them on dedicated devices, different systems that you can see around as well. I'm showing here to contrast what a grid display would look like. I find many people think of a grid layout when they're thinking of an AAC system, but really there's a lot of different ways that you can be depicting vocabulary concepts for your users. So a grid-based system, here's an example on the right. This is from the app Proloquo Go, but you can find these types of displays on a number of systems. Their vocabulary is often organized in a categorical arrangement, which is kind of what you see here at the bottom. You'll see categories like food or places. This is a really common way that you'll see vocabulary set up with a lot of systems. There are some other arrangements, such as one that's organized by event or schematically, but it's a common way that you can do it so that you have a lot of vocabulary that's not all available to you on one level. What you're going to see with a grid-based display is that all of your vocabulary is going to show up on a button or a box. So it's going to use a row column setup, just like any other grid that you might see, in order to lay it out for the user. Because of that, you have to process all that vocabulary and where it's located on the display. It doesn't necessarily have to be accessed visually. There are ways you can set up a grid where the AAC user is accessing it through auditory input. We're not really going to be talking about that today for our purposes, but in general, the vocabulary is isolated in these separate boxes for someone to process and then access. The language in a grid-based display is what we would call decontextualized language. So the word want is located on this page and the word get. Nothing about the page in and of itself or the vocabulary on this page are really going to help you to determine what those words mean. Your knowledge of the concept has to come from somewhere else. And that's something that you're going to hear me talk about a lot today with visual scene display and kind of one of the big differences between those organizations. There are some good things about a decontextualized organization. It can be nice to use for generalization. So for example, on that little box that's sitting on the line over there, I can use that on if I'm talking about a concept that's on my mind or something that's located on the top of my refrigerator. And it doesn't really matter because it's a very generic image that you see there. So it's a little easier to apply that concept to multiple situations. Another thing that you'll see with grid-based displays is you need either some level of symbolic knowledge or some literacy skills. You have to have that concept represented somehow. So in this case, you see the displays using both. There's symbols to represent most of these concepts, as well as a word underneath it that someone potentially could be reading in order to understand what this is meaning to reference. Again, it could be set up with an auditory scan, so it could be something that they're hearing, but it does require that knowledge. The symbol for stop might be something that you would represent or recognize quite easily coming from the environment, But some of these other ones, such as the equal sign up there for is, might be a little less transparent if you couldn't read the word is. So something that needs to be thought about when you're coming up with the vocabulary organization for an individual. This was a great setup that was created by Jenna Slide. She was really looking to separate out for us how to think about some of those concepts in a nice, easy way. So how can you represent that vocabulary in a grid display? So like we just saw, you can use symbols, you can use orthography or line drawings. A visual scene display, by its very nature, you're going to have either a photograph or a line drawing of some kind to represent those concepts. The grid displays are going to be pretty limited in terms of their personalization. Now, of course, you can customize them. I can create a whole display around somebody's pets or their family members, things like that. But in general, like we saw, that vocabulary is going to be more generic in terms of how it's portrayed. Whereas a visual scene display, because it's using photos, tends to be much more personalized. They're frequently made with photographs from the individual's life or environment. Although there are some generic ones that do exist, I'm going to show you some today, but they still tend to be customized. You're going to see pictures with little rooms and little pictures on them, things like that. The context, like we just talked about, is very low for a grid display. You're not getting a lot of information from the grid itself in order to understand that vocabulary. Whereas the visual scene display, because you're using a photograph, there's a lot of extra information in there. And there's certainly things you can do when selecting your photograph to help support that context. We're going to talk about some of those ideas today. But in general, you're going to have much more support for both the AAC user and their communication partner in terms of understanding what the context is for that communication action that's happening. So for the grid, the layout's going to be in a grid. There's a couple of different layouts for visual scene displays. I'm going to show you a few examples. Some of them are a full and complete visual scene display, so just a giant photograph with hotspots, things like that. Sometimes they're going to be what here is shown as a combo, and you'll sometimes see it called a hybrid, where you'll also see elements of a grid that will allow you some flexibility. You can incorporate some text in those situations. Different types of messages can be incorporated that way. So it gives you some flexibility there. So a lot of similarity in terms of the management. It really depends on the program that's utilized. You can set up both of those systems really to have menu pages. You can have navigation bars. You can have the scenes. You can have images there to represent other pages, but you can also link symbols as well to pop up or take you to other pages. One thing that is different is going to be that retrieval of the concept. So again, with that grid, you're going to have to select the item itself and touch that button or scan that button. Within a visual scene display, one thing that's very different are hotspots. So you literally highlight and isolate these aspects of the picture, and it turns them into the button that they're interacting with, that communicates the message or links to the new page, etc. You can also have the grid spaces, like I said, so you can kind of incorporate several of those elements. Another big difference, and something to think about when you're thinking about the AAC users in your life, is that traditional grid display is really used for communication. You know, it's that decontextualized language that we're using, maybe combining to communicate information or wants or needs with a partner. A visual scene display, because of the nature of a photograph, particularly the personal photographs, you can also use it to support the conversation. So there are strategies that a communication partner can use where maybe they're looking at the shared scene, there's now a joint referent, and maybe they're gesturing at the picture to ask some follow-up questions. If you know the AAC user has other communication means at their disposal, maybe they have a head nod or a yes/no or gesturing, you can really use that shared referent to communicate information that isn't programmed into a button. It's also great for, there's some learning activities that can be done around it, a shared activity in general. For individuals with certain cognitive impairments, particularly around memory, the use of those visual scenes can also act for memory displays and ways to talk about past events as well. And obviously the visual scene display can still be set up to support communication as well. So why consider a visual scene display for your user? A visual scene display is a great way to capture certain events in the person's life. So taking specific photographs from vacations or graduations, things like that, and using those to create scenes that are meaningful to the AAC user. It's going to give the user a lot more support to help them with their interaction because of that added context. They're going to see the different things that they're talking about in the environment that they naturally occurred, possibly with people interacting with objects or interacting with each other, and giving more information about the topic that they're engaging with. And then it's going to allow that communication partner, as we were just discussing, to be more active in that process. They can use it to help add information, to ask supplemental questions, and to possibly continue that communication exchange across more interactions. So here's an example of that more generic visual scene display. This one's using a drawing or a symbolic drawing, whereas the one on the right is more personalized. It's a digital photograph of a person's kitchen. So again, pluses and minuses, this would really depend on the user. You know, a lot of people benefit from maybe that star is a button on the cabinet that is really specific to the snacks that somebody likes to eat. And that's their cabinet and they know their snacks are in there. Whereas looking at that bedroom, it's not their bedroom. One thing you can notice though, the people who created that scene were really looking at contrasting colors. So they created a white bed on that green background. That is something to be aware of with photographs. It can be very tricky to take a good photograph. If you are working with someone who has any degree of visual impairment, cortical visual impairment, really looking at pictures that have some degree of contrast to them, minimizing the amount of information. There are individuals with cortical visual impairment, for example, where a photograph is not necessarily recommended. And I would strongly encourage, if you have someone like that that you're working with, to seek out someone like a teacher that's visually impaired or a TVI and talk with them about those specific recommendations. Sometimes the use of contrasting color or stark borders, things like that, will allow them to be more successful in interpreting that visual information. The other thing that happens is if you get a lot of superfluous visual information, it can be a little hard to find the topic or benefit from that added context. So it's something to bear in mind. So the types of people who can benefit from a visual scene display, beginning communicators are one of those groups. Those can include children. All children go through a beginning communicating phase, but not all beginning communicators are children. So typically when we say that, we are talking about people who are pre-symbolic, meaning they're maybe using a lot of gesturing and a lot of real objects. You know, they go and get the book if they want to read the book kind of idea, but not doing so well with symbols yet or using a lot of traditional spoken language. Obviously, all children go through that phase, but there are a number of people who are older who are still in that phase who could benefit from a visual scene display. So why consider a visual scene display for children? One thing that's really beneficial is looking at teaching language concepts without having to spend a lot of time teaching that symbol. Because it's embedded in a photograph with that added context with it, they can really deal with the action or the environment or whatever the concept is that you're working with without having to deal with all those other elements. One thing that's really interesting is that there's been a fair amount of research. So a lot of symbols that are out there are designed by adults. They were not necessarily tested on children. And one thing that's been found is that some children don't do as well with all symbol sets. So on the right is a brief summary of one study that occurred where they looked at 50 typically developing children. And they showed them a bunch of PCS symbols, which are a really common symbol set that you see with a number of traditional devices, as well as programs like BoardMaker. And you can kind of see here that want, which is often the first symbol, that gets introduced to a lot of children. Only 4% of the children that were shown that symbol were able to determine that it was the word want. So that is something that can be said for some of these symbols that are used in a lot of the grid-based displays. Children typically don't include parts of objects or things like that when they're representing concepts. If they look at pictures that children have drawn, they don't use parts of people either. They're looking at the whole item. So a little bit different than what you see in some of the symbols. The language in a visual scene display, again, is embedded within that context, so they're going to benefit from seeing it. If they're wanting to participate in a game where they're rolling the ball back and forth, you can take a photograph of a couple of children rolling a ball back and forth, and maybe the kid with the ball, you touch that child, and it says something like "my turn," whereas the other kid whose arms are open waiting to catch it says something like "roll me the ball." So based on what they're able to see in that image, it's going to help them find the vocabulary that they need to communicate, and then they can participate in that activity and get reinforced. We've also seen that there's typically more visual attention with visual scene displays. Children are really drawn to images with people, for example. They tend to look longer at visual scene displays and look through the pictures more than they do with some of the grid-based options that are out there. Some studies have showed that they're more accurate with visual scene displays as well, presumably because of some of those things like the added context and keeping their visual attention sustained longer. The other thing that can be really helpful is that because it's a photograph, it's going to maintain how things are existing in the world. So things like size, the person as related to the ball that they're playing with or a door that they're walking through. The size is going to maintain proportionate with each other. The location of where things are occurring, the relationships between them, all those types of things, as you would see them in the real world, that's how they're going to be represented in an image because it was taken in that environment. And finally, a photograph can replicate an exact experience or language interaction and really access and utilize, kind of capitalize on that episodic memory. So recalling that event might encourage that communication interaction in the future. When I work with teams on selecting images for visual scene displays, this is probably the thing that we spend the most time on with visual scene displays, really making sure they're good pictures. So again, we tend to be attracted to people in pictures within the first couple of seconds, more so than other elements typically. Even when other elements are larger, we go looking for people. In general, people respond to animated facial expressions, or those that are considered appealing, not just static photos, posed photos. They also look at animate figures like animals and things that are really central in the photo, so not off-centered funny. In general, young children, it's been shown that they prefer photographs over those line drawings, again, with some exceptions for vision, things like that. We do want to look for motivating images, so things that they're going to respond to, maybe that access some of that memory. And you can always start with just a single hotspot for a given interaction and then add to it as you go. Other things that come up a lot these days are looking at the picture itself and the quality of the photo, things like the lighting. You really, when you're talking about apps, need to look at the size of how it's going to be portrayed. If it's a picture with a ton of information and then it's getting shrunken down to only part of the screen, it's going to be much harder to visually interpret than a picture maybe that's more simplified and really zeroed in on the relevant action or vocabulary concept. So coming up with examples and things to look at with people can be very, very helpful. Here's an example of what a visual scene display might look like when working with children. So you can see they're engaged in a craft activity. You could make the people hotspots. You could make some of the supplies in the hotspots. And then along the bottom, this is more akin to that grid, some of those color concepts that maybe the child is working on. So this allows for kind of that hybrid approach and gives them more vocabulary to communicate with in a given activity. Another population that we use visual scene displays for the other end of the spectrum, actually adults, and particularly those who have had strokes. So individuals with aphasia, there are different types of aphasia. Depending on site of injury, it can really have different and diffuse symptomatology. So this is not for every person with aphasia. Again, whole separate topic of conversation. But there is definitely a large group who benefits from the use of visual scene displays. In particular, when looking at it, you'll find that people who have aphasia, even though their language might be impaired and their ability to speak or expressively communicate may be impaired, their intellectual ability is often retained. They may have a really strong visual spatial abilities still, and memory may be quite strong depending on the individual. Weaknesses in general, so that processing speed, challenges with attention and problem solving. So in thinking about, navigating through a grid-based display where there's potentially a lot of subcategorization going on, having to sustain across that, it can be a real challenge. When choosing an image, Buchelman did a great presentation that you can see where he talks a lot about some of those elements that are really necessary. And he specifically highlights that a photograph should have 3 to 5 pieces of information. So again, thinking about how partners can also support the communication attempt with somebody who's using a visual scene display. So having things like, if I'm on vacation, maybe the group of people that I went on the trip with are all gathered together for a photo in front of the location where we're vacationing. So I have that background and that environmental knowledge as well. And maybe we're holding a funny thing that we found in the gift shop or something like that. So we have a number of items that you can see right within the photograph that are going to tell you about the event or the interaction that happened. There's a number of studies that have shown that support for conversation is especially beneficial to adults with aphasia. They often have a lot of splintered skills that they retain with communication. So they may be able to communicate some words or have a lot of gestures, things like that. So it can be very beneficial to have those visual supports as well to help them expand upon their communication. And engagement, it's very engaging to show, they're very personalized. It's a great way to share those memories. People are very responsive to photographs that are being shared. So it's a good way to expand on those communication interactions for that population. Now, this is one example of an adult visual scene display. So in this case, you can see there's the individual with aphasia and her grandson. There's text that goes along with it as well. One thing that has been found is some adults that have word finding challenges, for example, really benefit from having some text on the screen as well. Not universal, but some of them really do. So this would be more of that hybrid display that you're seeing here. Some of the buttons with text will then speak and they will say the messages that you see. And in this case, the buttons are on the outside are all used for navigation. So on the grid-based display, you select the button, it takes you to another page with more language. In this case, you can see the other scenes that were available to this person. She could select one of those scenes right from there. It would take her there. And from that point, she has a whole new scene to interact with. So I want to look at a few apps that support the use of visual scene displays. GoTalk Now has a couple of app options, actually. They have a light version that is free, and it gives you 5 pages, but they're fully functional pages. So it is a great way to try out their app. Pretty much any of the functions that it has are available to you, and it gives you a great way to try it without spending a lot of money. The full version that gives you the unlimited number of pages and books, which are almost kind of like users, is $100. And then if this is an app you knew in the past, they did add a plus version, and that includes the symbol sticks library already with it, a new Ready, Set, Communicate book, and expanded voice options. So this app is available on iOS devices. It does support the use of symbols. You can purchase PCS or symbol stick symbols. You can import personal photos, internet search photos, and it also supports video as well. And a couple of the apps that I'm going to show you today support the use of video. There, you can record speech for the users, use the text-to-speech, and you can purchase additional voices if you don't prefer any of the ones that come for free. A nice thing about this program, it does support switch scanning as well. Not all of them do, as well as traditional direct touch type access. I'm only showing you a couple examples of the visual scenes right now, but just be aware this app does support grid-based communication as well. So you could have the same program and have a combo approach with GoTalk, which is very nice. The scene on the left, you can see it's being set up. They're in an edit mode and they're creating those hotspots. So in this case, you can kind of see how you can put the image on there. You can expand the square to really change the size and shape of what you want to include in that hotspot location. And then you'll record whatever the message is that you want to say. So it's very user-friendly in terms of how you edit and create those hotspots. On the right, it's kind of showing you one of those hybrids. So you can have the scene over to the right, and then on the left, you can have some of those standard buttons with longer messages potentially, change up the navigation, things like that. So really, it's a pretty flexible app, relatively inexpensive, and Attainment's been around. This app has been around for a while, so their support is relatively strong. More recently, in the last couple of years, the Attainment company also came out with the app GoVisual. This one's $50, and it supports the use of video as well as photographs. You can see the image on the right is showing sort of a collage effect, which is a little bit different from a lot of the scenes, but you could do just as they're showing an assortment of pictures related to a scene in more of a decorative, almost scrapbook fashion. Which could be appealing to some, especially I'm thinking those adults may really find that appealing. One thing I will note, we've used this with a number of adults, the navigation on this one can be a little bit tricky just because of the sizing. So you do want to look at, I think with any of these apps, trialing out some of that functionality. You know, how are they going to navigate? What is the size? What are your options for creating elements for them to navigate they can physically access? Compared to other apps. Seen and Heard, now this app has been around for a while, but if you hadn't seen it in a bit, they did a sizable update a little bit in the past and really added a fair amount of functionality. It's $84.99, also available on iPhones and iPads. You can see the scene on the left, how they've created some hotspots there with their grocery purchase, as well as using their symbol library underneath. Therapy Box is a European entity, and so they use widget symbols, but they do support the use of photographs and things like that as well as video. You can provide digital recordings or text-to-speech, and they do have direct access as well as switch scanning. Even though we're talking about visual scenes, I did want to show you on the right there, some of the features Seen and Heard has added include a scheduling function where you can see the schedule and add photographs to it, which could benefit a whole bunch of people. But the other thing they've added, you can see on the right, is this task idea. So it's showing the steps of brushing your teeth, and you can step through those sequenced items and help support the AAC user in completing whatever that task is. So that's a newer function that's contained within the same app, and any AAC user that you're using it with would have access to all of those features with that one purchase. Steamspeak is another app for $9.99. This is one of our less expensive options. Now this one does come with 11 of those generic scenes. There's one for you to see on the left, so that have the symbols in it for you to kind of see and start out with. But you can also create your personal or online images with it. The one on the right is showing you they have a nice way to embed that navigation, kind of like the pop-up style. So they select the fridge, the next scene is the open refrigerator. So it flows really well for some users to navigate that way, and they've embedded it in their program quite nicely. This one does support direct access and digital recordings as well. Now, TouchChat is the more expensive app that I'm showing you today. They have a version that's $149.99 as well as one that's $299.99, depending on the language program that they have in it. So definitely something that you'd want to look at and talk about. But it does support the use of visual scene displays. So you get that more robust language program with the grids and all of the different language options there, but you can incorporate visual scene displays with it. So you see that hybrid option there on the left. There are templates in it to set something up like that. I also included kind of their examples of how you would create a visual scene display in their more standard app, and you can kind of see how you have to merge the buttons. So not as easy to program maybe as the other scene you saw where you just kind of drag the shape, but the functionality is there. It ends up looking like what you see on the right, and by the end of it, the user doesn't see any of that. The app comes with symbol stick symbols, but it does support photographs, and you can purchase PCS symbols now. Their text-to-speech function also has Spanish option, by the way, which is very nice. And depending if you have an iPad Pro, it also supports the use of head tracking, which is not a lot of apps are doing it so far, but it is something that I would imagine is going to continue to expand now that the iPad Pro is offering that. If any of those apps look interesting to you, all of their websites have a ton of information. They're very useful online, but definitely reach out to us at FAAST. Our information and assistance exists to be able to give you information about any of these types of programs, talk to you about the pros and cons, and how to make those selections. You can come in and we can demonstrate some of those different features for you. If you're interested in a particular program, we can provide training on any of its features. And of course, before you purchase, it's always good to borrow and try. So FAAST does loans at no cost. You can take an iPad with even a couple of the apps to try them out, test out some of those things like the physical access that's required to navigate that I mentioned, trying to see how the programming functions work for you before you actually make the decision to purchase. Are there any questions about any of that? All right, well, thank you very much for coming. That's a very brief overview of visual scene displays. And like I said, please reach out to your FAAST Center if you're interested, and we can help set you up to try some out for yourself. Have a great holiday, everybody.